Tyler? Ashley? What do you call somebody that's into yachting? A sailor? Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What is on My Wrist, we are talking about a very interesting Heuer. It is a Autavia Skipper. It's a very interesting watch. This one is in incredible condition, and on top of that, it's a first execution and an interesting one at that. So let's get into the details. So, if you are a fan of Heuer watches and also into sailing and racing, regattas, you are probably familiar with the Heuer Skipper. So here's kind of the background story of the Skipper, and I want to give a special shout out to On the Dash. On the Dash is a great vintage Heuer resource. They do a great job of compiling information, and they've featured a couple of our watches, and they've got a really great database that talks about not only the different Heuer references, but also the history behind them. And they have really detailed photographs showing like the different calibers of movement and dial variants and all that kind of stuff. So I'll provide a link in the description below so that you can check out On the Dash and the articles that kind of go over the Skipper. But basically, the Skipper story is kind of interesting. Heuer provided a crew of a sailing team with stopwatches and chronographs and other timing equipment. And I believe that the name of the racing team, and I think it was in 1967 for the America's Cup, was the Intrepid. As a result of this, Heuer celebrated the launch of this type of regatta timer in 1968 with what we now kind of refer to as like the Skipperera. So the Skipperera is a Heuer Carrera that basically has at the 3 o'clock sub dial, basically a regatta countdown timer, and it's in a case that is more traditional kind of Heuer Carrera-like. So a little bit different than this, but essentially that was the first Heuer Skipper or regatta timer. And what's interesting about that, instead of the chronograph counting up to 30 minutes, it basically counted down 15 minutes. So if you look at the 3 o'clock subdial, not only on this Skipper, but on other Heuer Skippers, it's basically a subdial that allows you to count down time, not necessarily like record it. Obviously you could record it if you wanted to, but I guess the intention is that when you're running the chronograph, you can not only use like a tachometer scale and things like that to track speed or distance or whatever you want, but the most important feature or complication rather in detail of the watch is that it's got a regatta timer, which is basically used to count down. So really, really interesting. There's a bunch of different Heuer Skippers, if you will, and basically in this specific video, what we're talking about is a really interesting version that uses an Autavia style case. And the other thing that's really interesting about this specific one is the reference is 73463, and the watch uses a Valjoux 7734 manually wound chronograph movement. So most Autavias, not all, but a lot of Autavias leverage like micro rotor movements and they're automatic. This 7734 is obviously not an automatic movement. It's a manually wound chronograph movement, which makes this version of the Autavia Skipper kind of that much more interesting. There's a lot of different versions of the Heuer Autavia Skippers. For sake of this video, we're not going to dive into all of them. We've had a couple of them via the Craft and Tailored shop, and I'll provide a link in the description below and above so that you can kind of check out the Skippers. So in the late 1970s, Heuer modified basically the automatic Autavia so that it would accommodate not just these manual wound, Valjoux based movements, but they also did them with their self-winding or micro-rotor based movements. Matter of fact, I think in like 1972, 1973, Heuer actually modified the Autavia case to also use a mineral glass crystal, which is common with the Autavia line of chronographs. But what's really cool about this first execution is that the 73463 uses has a light crystal rather than a mineral glass. So it's kind of an earlier version. And I believe that these are from the late 1960s into the early 1970s, whereas we see the sapphire crystals in, I think, starting around 1972, 1973. So kind of interesting. The cool thing about this watch is it's very eye-catching, right? We've got your typical Autavia style hands. There's orange accents that are over blue. It's kind of a cool watch from the perspective if you're into sailing and if you're into racing racing or yacht racing, it's kind of a cool and functional watch. I think that that's kind of the cool thing about the Autavia range of watches. And we've talked a lot about Autavia and that range of watches. I've done a bunch of different videos on Heuer Autavias. This one is a favorite of mine. And matter of fact, I actually purchased a really cool Skipper from my good friend Eric Wind. The version that I got was a little bit later, and it was a black dial, not a blue dial. The reference was 11063V, and it's a watch that I had in my collection for a good minute, but it's one that I kind of miss a little bit. So I'm kind of having a bit of a romance with this one because I wasn't wearing the watch much, and I ended up, passing it on, and it's a watch that I kind of missed. So kind of going back to the overall design, I think that, the cushion case of the Autavia is really cool. I like that this is an earlier version, and the blue is just kind of really striking. It's nice, on wrist, and I kind of think that blue dial watches remind me of like being in the sun. I could see being on a boat with this, even though I don't have a boat. It kind of transports me to that kind of like warm, kind of funky, vibey type of feeling. Same thing with maybe like some of the blue dial Tudors and stuff like that. I think that there's also a visibility element here with blue dial watches. Obviously we've got, really orange, bright, high contrast hands that seem to jump off the dial. There's orange accents at each hour marker. And then obviously, the Regatta timer being, red, white, and blue is also very eye-catching. So it's kind of a watch that, really jumps out and pops. Again, kind of maybe talking a little bit more about just the Skippers. The Skipper is, I guess, a variant, right? So what's kind of unique, I guess, about the Skipper and the Skippereras and that line of watches is typically we'll see it as like a dial variant. I don't know if you really would call this necessarily a complication. I guess it's more of like a feature. So the Regatta timer, it's really more of a way of keeping track of time in a different way that is built for a specific application. The cool thing about a lot of the Autavias is that they are tool watches in the truest sense, is that they are built to serve a purpose. So form definitely meeting function. Kind of circling back really quick though, again, we see the Skippers in watches that, like the Carrera or the Skipperera or like the Autavia, for example, that might be more suited for like automotive racing or whatever, but we see this dial variant kind of being adopted and utilized for its application, which is, yacht racing. And so what makes these very special is that, alongside of kind of your normal standard production of Autavias or Carreras or whatever you have it, you'll very uncommonly see these versions, which makes them very special and unique. So let's talk a little bit about the features of this specific example. I'll kind of dive into the tech specs because I know that you guys love that stuff. And I'll kind of talk a little bit more about this 73463 and kind of give you an inside look at it. So we talked a little bit about the dial, really cool kind of deep blue dial. What's cool about the Regatta timer is it's oversized. It's almost kind of like Big Eye in a way. If you look at the running seconds hand, which is located at the 9 o'clock position on the dial, that subdial is much smaller. It is, stepped and it's built into the base plate portion of the dial. And then the other thing that's interesting is that Regatta timer is very large, which is also a feature of that dial. So these dials were, I don't want to say modified dials, they were kind of dials that were built for this specific application while leveraging, movements and cases and things like that out of the other Autavias. What's cool is we have a minutes and hours bezel, which is also in blue. This one is kind of taken on like a really nice, charming patina. It's kind of like a powdery baby blue, which also accents the dial really, really nicely. And on the 73463s, it's a non-rotating bezel, so it's a fixed minutes and hours bezel. Again, high contrast orange hands, which is kind of the fun thing about Heuer is, again, form meeting function. Quickly at a glance, you can really see what the time is. And then the hands within the subdials of the Regatta timer are also high contrast. The Regatta hand is this kind of big, broad, black, high visibility hand, which is really, really cool. The other thing too that's kind of something to note about the Autavias that are manually wound versus automatic is that the manually wound versions that leverage, in most cases, the Valjoux 7734s is you have the crown on the more traditional side, which is on the right side of the case. On the other Autavias, you actually have a flip-flop crown because those being automotive-based watches, they flip-flop the crown so that you ultimately, when you had your hand up on a steering wheel, the crown wouldn't dig into the top side of your wrist while leaving the two pushers to operate the chronograph function on the side that you could, use with your non-driving hand, I guess. If you're shifting a car with the right hand, you can operate it, right? And most people are right-hand dominant, so In any case, something kind of interesting to note about this. This one also does include its original Beads of Rice Gayfarer's bracelet, which is really, really cool. The original HLFN pieces, which is also very cool. For whatever reason, finding an original bracelet with these watches is kind of hard to do. I know based on some of the old advertisements and stuff like that, the watches were sold on both these Gayfarer's Beads of Rice bracelets, and the name Beads of Rice kind of comes from like the center links where it's kind of like this mesh, but if you look at it, they could be like kind of looked at as like a grain of rice. And Gayfarer's was a company among a few that was producing these, bracelets for not only Heuer, but a lot of other watches at the time. So the Gayfarer's bracelets are really, really nice and ultimately sought after. These watches were sold definitely on the bracelet and also on a strap. It kind of makes sense for them to be sold on a strap as well, because if this watch is going to be around water and kind of more that active lifestyle, I guess the idea was that, you could have like a tropic or rubber type of strap that would accommodate that being, it would dry easily and, be worn on the wrist. So I've kind of seen them in both formats. So quick tech specs really quick. Again, high grade Valjoux caliber 7734. Case diameter is 41 millimeters. So not a small watch, but also not really that oversized. It wears nicely on the wrist. I love the Gayfarer's bracelet. Really cool kind of flip lock bracelet. No diver's extension in this one. Heuer logo embossed horizontally. Overall very, very cool watch. In any case, thought I'd share that with you. I really like vintage Heuers. I think they're kind of on the come up a little bit. I think that the pricing on vintage Heuers was inflated for a little while, but I think that Heuers are really interesting watches altogether, and they provide a lot of value. I like the horological history behind them. I like the colorways that they were using on the dials, and I think they're just really neat watches. So I'm not sure if this one is gonna make it to the website. I might be keeping this one for myself. I also prefer the manual wound version. I noticed that the cases are a little bit thinner than the ones that leverage the micro rotor movement, so it's kind of more ergonomic and nice on my wrist. In any case, we've written some cool stuff about Heuer Skippers, and then also be sure to check out On the Dash, because they've done a great job of compiling a ton of information about the history of the Skipper and other Heuers, and it's a great resource that we use here at Craft & Tailor all the time. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't done so already, check us out on Instagram at Craft & Tailored. If you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored. And thanks again for tuning in. I will see you guys in the next one. Yahtzee.